The wildlife and wild places of Menorca. I see this as an antidote to life for those of us trapped in a long grey winter on Plague Island. But I'm going to start with a heresy. There's a lot more to life than birds. And I'm going to show you a lot more. We're talking about wildlife. It's certainly not going to be a lot just about birds. We're going to be covering everything about the wild aspect of Menorca. And I say, to just give you a whole rounded view of what to me is one of my very favourite places in the world. Now, Menorca is one of the Balearic Islands, highlighted there on the map. Balearic Islands, this archipelago off the coast of Spain, with mainly Ibiza, Mallorca and Menorca. They're islands, they're isolated. They form a group, however, and they have a very distinct wildlife within that group. There are plants, animals, even birds, which are unique or endemic to that group of islands. They're linked functionally to other parts of Europe. The rest of the Western Mediterranean islands, Corsica and Sardinia, if we take the Balearics and Corsica and Sardinia, that's called the Tyrrhenian region. And there are animals and plants endemic to that wider region too. So what we're going to be looking at here is a whole host of interesting plants and animals, some of which are unique to either the wider area of the Western Mediterranean or the Tyrrhenian region or the Balearics, or even some unique, endemic to the island of Menorca itself. Fascinating place. Also, of course, as you see, it's in the middle of the Mediterranean. So it is effectively a migratory stepping stone for those creatures that migrate. It's only a small island. Size-wise, it's about the same size as the Tendring Peninsula in northeast Essex. 30 kilometres by 15 kilometres at the most. It's diverse, but it's gentle. Diverse in its scenery, its human scenery, its wild habitats, ranging from drylands to coastlands to wetlands, cliffs and gorges, right through to the one mountain on the island, right at its very centre, 350 metres of Monte Toro, from the point at which you can see the whole of the island from that particular view. Now, to understand its wildlife, of course, we need to understand what contributes to the interesting wildlife there. Geology is always one of those underpinning features, and the vast majority of Menorca is limestone, typical limestone landscapes here with the bare, eroded rocky ground, often with a very high density of flowers growing on it. This is absolutely characteristic of about 3/4 of the entire island. In the final quarter, there are older rocks or different rocks, particularly red sandstone in places, which forms these really quite dramatic landscape features. Some of them absolutely wonderful, with the wind honeycomb erosion on those sandstone faces, providing wonderful breeding niches for kestrels, peregrines, blue rock thrushes, and even the occasional booted eagle in the northeastern sector of the island. And then in the very far northeast, you come to shales, very different landscape, eroded laminar shales, which are bare and windswept and contain an awful lot of exciting fossils. The shales have the trace fossils of the creatures which lived in the mud, which was laid down and then compressed into the shales, the trace fossils of the burrows and the living, those creatures you can see here, the worms and the mollusks tracks inside those shales Those are the creatures which were killed by the cataclysmic events which led to the creation of the shales. So volcanic action and major upheavals at the time the Mediterranean basin was formed. So geology is one thing, geography is another. As you saw from the plant right at the beginning, it is at the crossroad of the continents. It's off the European coast. It's linked to the European coast by the continental shelf, but it's between Europe and Africa. And particularly in plant terms, there are lots of botanical links with Africa. You can see two of those specialities there, being the dwarf fan palm and a large grass called Amplodesmus mauritanicus, both of which are more North African in distribution than European. The next factor which affects the wildlife that we now see in Menorca is its history. And this history, or at least the early history, is absolutely fascinating. In fact, this is really archaeology rather than history. We have human influence on the island dating from more than 3,500 years ago, when the first of the major cultures of Menorca appeared. And that was the Talaiotic culture, which produced an awful lot of megalithic structures, settlements, and there are something like 350 places around Menorca which have these particular cultures. These are the people who were dispersed, the diaspora, from Crete when Santorini went up in smoke in the form of a volcano. These are the Minoans, and they headed in the direction of Menorca. There was the first place they settled in Western Europe, and from there their culture spread on through mainland Spain, through the Basque region, and ultimately right up the western seaboard of the Atlantic Ocean, right to the Celtic cultures of the northwest European archipelago where we're sitting. So the Talaiotic culture has been around for a very long time, heavily based on stones, and stones are a feature of Menorca wherever one goes, whether it's in the field systems, where dry stone walls have been used primarily, I suppose, to take the stones out of the fields to allow them to be cultivated. The major settlements on Menorca date from the first capital of Menorca. Top left is Ciutadella, which is at the left-hand end, the western end of the island, on a deep water port. That's the historic capital from times when the main links of Menorca were directly with the Spanish mainland and Aragon and Catalonia. Then on the eastern end of the island, we come to the modern capital of Mahon, or Mao, which is more recent and indeed was developed primarily by the Brits, or the English, who took over Menorca for 2 or 3 periods in history, fighting over it with the French and the Aragonese respectively, because of its value, strategic value as a deep water port, the most significant deep water natural harbour in the entire Western Mediterranean. Modern history, of course, has been a little less kind, perhaps, with extensive, or fairly extensive in places, tourist developments, although very little high rise. It's not suffered, it's not a brash place, a brash island like many other parts of the Mediterranean. It's not suffered from overdevelopment by tourism, because 25 years ago, they realised in Menorca that they have an island full of wildlife and history, which should be celebrated and supported, and secured its designation as a biosphere reserve. So that has shaped the tourism sector within the island substantially ever since then, with the result that we still have an awful lot of wildlife to be found, and not too many areas where you can't walk because of the Brits or the Germans lying on the beaches. Linked in with the tourist development, or the biosphere reserve, has been the development of a historic route around the island, the Camí de Cavalls, the horseman's route, which is a coastal route, public access right around the island for use by pedestrians, horses and bicycles. It's one of the very first coastal routes to be put around a significant area anywhere within Europe, second only to the route around the coast of France. And that provides wonderful access to a great range of Menorca's lovely habitats. Weather and climate, of course, do influence the wildlife that we see for a very good reason. This is an island which is very windswept, and because it's windswept and a small island, it's salt sprayed all over it, hence leading to the sort of salt sculpturing of the coastal and indeed even inland vegetation you can see in the top left. It's a dry island relatively, although it does rain, particularly in the winter. And when it does rain, it rains heavily. So there's a great contrast between the heavy rain periods and the almost totally dry 4-5 months from May through to September in the middle of the year. It's very hot in the summer and it's mild in the winter, mild and damper in the winter. So ideal growing conditions. Even in midwinter, you can go there and find wildlife. At this time of year, the Friar's Cowl and the Maiden's Bower clematis, both flowering away furiously right through the winter period. And during the winter period, there you can find birds which throughout most of the rest of Europe are no longer present because of the time of year. They're present throughout the year, including stone curlew, Scops owl and hoopoes. That's not totally unique within Europe, but certainly there are a few places you can see those things and encounter those things so easily during the winter months. So midwinter is fine for visiting for wildlife. Equally, so is midsummer, despite the heat, despite the tourists. Well, even on the tourist beaches, you will find this wonderful plant growing, the sand daffodil, beautifully scented. And if you visit the sand daffodils and indeed the adjacent plantings of such species, nectar-rich species in gardens there, you'll find convolvulus hawk moths flying around at night, feeding upon them. And then by day, all across the island, a good, strong breeding population of bee eaters. So midwinter, midsummer, still Menorca is wonderful. But the best times to go, of course, are always, as always, with anywhere in the Mediterranean, spring and autumn. Spring and autumn share some characteristics. They're times of migration. That's times to see birds from other parts of Europe on migration, heading through. But they're also very different. In spring, a lot more moisture, a lot more green, a lot more flowers. In the autumn, a lot browner, a lot drier, but at a time when the insect life is bigger and perhaps more abundant than at any other period. So spring and autumn are probably your most exciting times as a naturalist to go and visit. Spring is characterized by flowers. It is a very flower-rich island. Even all of the stony agricultural areas full of what are pejoratively thought of as weeds. We like to think of them as wildflowers. They are clothing the fields in all their glory and of course attracting insects of various sorts. There are lots of exciting plants, from the giant fennel on the right hand side here, a 2-meter tall fennel which comes out in its large flowering spikes and attracts insects from far and wide, through to other oddities such as the non-native Bermuda buttercup, top left, which is neither a buttercup nor from Bermuda. It is an oxalis from South Africa, but that has colonized, as it has, over much of the Mediterranean and is a major feature of the spring scene. One of the interesting features in much of the island is the density of flowering asphodels. Now, asphodels are bulbous species which grow happily in Mediterranean regions and grow especially well where the land is quite heavily grazed, or indeed you might even say overgrazed. Asphodel fields like that are a sign of overgrazing. And because asphodel is actually non-palatable to grazing stock. So if the areas, as some areas are overgrazed, then you'll see those dense patches of asphodel. But find the areas which are not so overgrazed, and there the density of flowers increases markedly. A lot of these are bulbous species, from gladiolus on the right to tassel hyacinth, gladiolus on the left, just tassel hyacinth on the right, through in the middle to the wonderful Arabian Star of Bethlehem. So vast numbers of bulbous species which are able to survive the drought of summer as heat-tolerant bulbs. Orchids too come into this category. And as with everywhere in the lowland parts of the Mediterranean, orchids are a springtime feature. From the very earliest ones coming out in February, the early orchid, going right through until May, orchids are present almost everywhere. Not a huge range compared to, for example, Crete, where orchid hunters go and can find up to 200 different types, if you believe all of the different splits that are currently in vogue in some parts of the taxonomic world. But they may not be so diverse, but they are, as you can see, wonderfully diverse and beautiful. Some of the selection of the orchids you can find in Menorca. Often confused with orchids growing in the same, often agricultural areas, are the broom rapes. These are interesting because they're totally parasitic plants dependent upon growing on the roots of the plants around them for their survival. Some very showy ones like the red broom rape going through to the branched broom rape on the right, and some very, very special ones. The one in the middle, the yellow one, thing called Orobanche yamanensis. It hasn't got an English name. That is known from 3 places only, all of which are areas, small areas on the north coast of Menorca. Absolutely unique biodiversity to the island of Menorca. So in these lowland, largely agricultural areas, we start to see the birds. An ever-present sound around the island, of course, is the singing of the corn bunting. We all know that. We don't hear it so much as we used to do, but there they do. It is all over the place. Mixing in with the scratchy songs, of course, of Sardinian warblers. And the other very significant feature of those arable areas are the crested larks. Not crested, that small c crested. These are not crested larks. There are no crested larks in Menorca. These are all Thekla larks. So if you want to be sure of seeing one or the other elsewhere in the Mediterranean, it's sometimes quite tricky to tell them apart, unless you can hear their song well or check out their underwing colours. They're all Thekla larks on Menorca. As I've mentioned already, it's a place of migration. Birds going through in the spring and the autumn. Can include anything, but often quite large falls of redstarts, pied flycatchers. There are other spring migrants which do move through in numbers, but also a few stay to breed. So nightingales and turtle doves both summer features as well as migration features on the island, and always a delight to see. The great thing about Menorca is that, unlike many other islands in the Mediterranean, there is no recent culture, at least, of bird trapping or bird killing. Everywhere in the lowlands, in the agricultural and scrub habitats, you will find butterflies, but being an island, it's not hugely rich in species. It's distant from the mainland, and many things have not colonized. It's also, as far as islands go, and as far as the Balearic Islands go, for example, it's very much less diverse in the overall scale of its landscape than, say, either Menorca, Mallorca or Ibiza. It doesn't have huge mountains, doesn't have too many very deep gorges. It doesn't have the habitat complexity, so it doesn't have the ecological niches to support huge numbers of species of butterfly. But there are some, and there are some interesting ones. They're typically Mediterranean brimstone relative, Cleopatra being one, together with, of course, as found everywhere around the Med, the common swallowtail, the one that here in the UK is on the very edge of its range and therefore can feed as a caterpillar only upon its very, very best food plant, which is the milk parsley growing in the Norfolk Broads. Where it's away from the edges of its range, it can feed upon a much larger range of food plants, many, many different species of umbellifer, including the giant fennel that I showed you earlier. Speckled woods are interesting in Menorca and indeed elsewhere in southwestern Europe. They're a very different looking speckled wood to our speckled wood. It is the southwestern subspecies. In the British Isles, the only form looking like that with the much deeper coloured panels on the wings, approaching that, is to be found in the Isles of Scilly. And then the wall, which is found upon Menorca, the wall butterfly, is this rather unusual, very pale form, paler form called adrasta. There are blue butterflies too, with the long-tail blue at the top and the Lang's short-tail blue being two of the most widespread. But we're only talking about 20 species of butterfly. It's not the sort of destination you would expect for a butterfly hunter. Moving into the heart of the island, you do come into pine woodlands, pine and oak woodlands. These are oaks, semi-evergreen oaks, the holm oak, together with Aleppo pines. Where there are spaces and gaps in the trees, that's where one finds a good rich flora of three of the sister species, the sun roses, the plants which almost define the spring in the Mediterranean region, two white-flowered ones and one pink-flowered one. And where you find the pink-flowered ones, Cistus albidus, look at the base, and down at the bottom you'll often find the flowering parasitic plant related to the giant rafflesias of the forest, the tropical rainforests. These are things called Cytinus species, totally parasitic, living more or less like a fungus in the tissues of the host plant, just every so often sending up this bunch of flowers from bare soil at the base of the cistus. These areas also have their orchids, and one or two of these are quite special. In the shade, the violet bird's nest orchid is the common one, but you can also find this one, which is an endemic to the Balearic Islands, very appropriately known as Ophrys balearica. It is one of the many, many bee-type orchids to be found around the Mediterranean, the centre of their speciation, but this one with its shiny small patch in the middle of its labellum is unique to the Balearic Islands. Within those woodland areas, particularly with large amounts of cistus, all sorts of other exciting creatures to find, and this is one of the ones that we found particularly exciting on one of my recent visits there. These wonderful hedgehog beetles. These are just spiny little beetles. They're a leaf beetle, totally unlike any of the leaf beetles we see here in the UK, covered in these fantastic hedgehog-like spines. And then if you turn over the rocks and stones, the stony ground in the more shadier areas, that's where you'll find the Balearic scorpion, the one species of scorpion on the Balearic Islands, not one which is going to cause a problem. It's only small, it doesn't hurt very much, although I've never tried it. It's reputed it doesn't hurt very much if it stings you, but they're again endemic to the Balearic Islands. The understory of the woodlands, often as not, is dominated by this plant. This is the well-named strawberry tree. It looks like strawberries, although it doesn't taste like strawberries. It's related to the heathers, and indeed is found in the islands of the British Isles, at least in the Republic of Ireland, as a native plant. It's a species which has what's termed a Lusitanian distribution, found from Ireland through the western seaboard of France, parts of Spain, Galicia, and into the western Mediterranean. Lovely plant, even lovelier for what it supports, because if you look at the leaves of that plant, you may well find that amazing little dragon living on the leaves. This is the caterpillar of probably the most dramatic butterfly of Europe, the two-tailed pasha, like a double-strength swallowtail with two tails on each of its wings. You don't often see it with its wings open, like on the top right there, but it is one of the most dramatic butterflies of our Mediterranean region, and one that's worth going to Menorca to see alone. Being a small island, the sea is very important around Menorca, and not only is Menorca, the whole of the island, designated as a biosphere reserve for its wildlife and archaeology, so most of the waters around Menorca are designated as marine nature reserves and as special areas of conservation under the European directives. Larger areas of the shallow seas around Menorca are clad in seagrass. This is a thing called Neptuna, seagrass beds, which are fantastic in a whole range of for a whole range of reasons, not least of which is they are wonderful stores of carbon. They are more effective at storing carbon than woodlands. Seagrass beds are a home for all sorts of biodiversity, and the birds, which will come on to feeding around the coast of Menorca later on, they're reliant, to some extent at least, on the fish and the invertebrates which feed amongst the seagrass. The seagrass also is deciduous and sheds its leaves in the winter, which then get washed up in huge banks on some of the beaches. Now, throughout the Mediterranean, Posidonia beds do that, but in most parts of the Mediterranean, the local authorities go out and remove the seagrass because as it rots down, it does start to whiff a little bit and it produces flies. The tourists that want to sit on the beaches don't like the flies. The birds do. Take away the flies, you get rid of the birds, the waders that would want to feed upon them. So it's fortunate that in most parts of Menorca, at least, the seagrass beds banks which get washed up are left in situ simply to sustain the biodiversity as befits a biosphere reserve. In storm conditions, the roots of the Fibrous roots of the seagrass gets washed up and they get jumbled around and jumbled together, more or less like the fluff in the bottom of a washing machine, into what are called sea balls, locally known as nuns' farts, or to be found all over the beaches, and just give an interesting indication as to the density of some of the seagrass beds in the shallow warm waters of Menorca. Around the shallow sandy beaches and the coasts of Menorca, you will find a lot of plants which look familiar. Because many plants are coastal plants, use the sea currents as dispersal vectors, you often find plants which are familiar in one part of Europe, in another part of Europe. They're transported by the coast, by the sea currents. And the golden samphire and the rock samphire here at the top are two, of course, which are very familiar to us, or this one very familiar, that one fairly familiar to us here in Essex and East Anglia. So these are all plants which are found more widely around the coasts of Western Europe. But moving up onto the immediately coastal areas, to the tops of the low cliffs, then you get into a very unique Menorcan habitats. These are the exposed windy headlands, the extremities, the areas where the forces of nature have eroded the land down to its very bare bones, or so it would seem, particularly if you go there during the autumn. But especially in the spring, they're a sight to be seen. In places, on certain rocks, those eroded areas are covered in this wonderful tree spurge. Beautiful in tree spurge in flower in different coloured forms here. And find your tree spurge, find the one that's been eaten, and that's where you'll find your spurge hawk moth caterpillars feeding away merrily on it. A larger one here with the red stripe down its back, and a smaller one with the yellow stripe down its back, beautifully camouflaged against the background of the stems of the tree spurge. On the more bare rock areas, there is a whole array of wonderful endemic plants. Now, here's just a very small selection of the endemic plants to the Balearics that are found around Menorca. We have plants like this very small ragwort with the purplish flowers. That's unique to the Balearics, as in this dwarf sea lavender is unique to Menorca, as is the dwarf foxglove. And then endemic to the Tyrrhenian region, so the Balearics and Corsica, Sardinia, is this marvellous, huge arum, sometimes called the dead horse arum for the reason of, by virtue of its smell. It is Dracunculus muscivorus, attracts flies by smelling like dead meat. A lot of the plants on these exposed windy areas are cushion-like plants. The cushion-like plant growth helps to give a defense against the eternally windy conditions, the salt spray conditions, and of course, when you get wind in Menorca, it can be very, very cold because it's not too far to the Alps. So good, strong northerly winds, the so-called tramontana winds coming into Menorca, can be exceedingly cold. Plants which grow in cushion form have some defense against that. Plants which grow in cushion form also are better at holding what water falls upon the landscape, as opposed to ones which grow in more open forms. Those cushion-like areas of scrub are the sort of place one would certainly go to look for tawny pipits and stone chats. Stone chats there are really quite fascinating. There's some very well coloured forms of stone chats which almost approach the extreme colours of in the males of some of the more eastern stone chat forms, even the variety of variegatus, which is sometimes treated as a species. I'm not saying that the ones in Menorca are those, but they certainly have some very distinctive colour forms of stone chats. But to return to the plants which grow as cushions, the other thing about growing a cushion, if you produce spines as well, then you're giving yourself a wonderful defence against the incessant browsing of the goats and sheep, which are widespread wandering around the island. We call these plants vegetable hedgehogs. The Menorcans call them soccerels, and these are perhaps some of the most important endemic species to the island or to the Balearics. There are lots of different species which adopt this form, and they're all totally unrelated. We have a type of milk vetch, we have a type of lettuce which does it. We have a type of asparagus, a type of knapweed, a type of dead nettle, even a type of lavender, rosemary, all of which more or less conform to this hedgehog type structure, the like of which is to be found only in the most extreme corners of the Balearic Islands. It is one of the great botanical and evolutionary delights of the Balearics. It's not to say it's not under threat. Even with the biosphere reserve in place, it is under threat, but not from developments, from the spread of alien plants, and particularly Hottentot fig, Carpobrotus, South African species, which was brought over to the Mediterranean, as with so many plants, and at a time when they were just brought and allowed to escape. They have escaped. This particular one is a menace there, as it is becoming, of course, a menace in parts of the UK, particularly down on the Lizard in Cornwall, where the winters are sufficiently mild to allow it to survive and to thrive, and it does, it thrives and swamps out all of the native flora. So swamping out the native flora where you have the endemic hedgehog plants at risk is a big problem, and part of the value of the biosphere reserve is to free up resources to allow the national park to go in and try eradicating, with some success, the Carpobrotus, the Hottentot fig. A further habitat feature of Menorca, which is of considerable value, are the barrancos, the gorges. They're often quite dry gorges, not all of them dry. This is the largest one on the island, about 10 kilometres long. It's the Algenda Gorge, well known to many tourists of the island, very close to the tourist centre of Cala Galdana. And that's the usual view of the Algenda Gorge. And that's the sort of place to go looking for the raptors. Indeed, they can be found all over the island, but this is where the raptors breed. 3 of the main raptors which breed on the island, the big ones being Egyptian vulture, red kite, and booted eagle, all found there in very good numbers. In fact, those are the only ones to be found in any large number on the island. There are marsh harriers down by the marshes. There are ospreys around the coast. 4 or 5 pairs of ospreys breed around on rocky coastlines in Menorca and stay there for the whole winter. Other high-flying birds, often to be found around the gorge area, as well as ravens, being the only large corvid on the island. Ravens are a little different to the corvids elsewhere in Europe. They're smaller, quite significantly smaller than ours, because they don't have carrying crows to compete with or to avoid competing with. This is again one of the features of island biogeography generally. You often get larger or smaller versions of animals which are found in different forms on continental land masses. Other raptors on the island include various falcons, particularly on a good migration period, red-footed falcons, often in quite significant swarms. The upper reaches of the Algenda Gorge, and indeed some of the more remote gorges, are also botanical treasure troves, hosting a whole range of endemic or near endemic plants. There are a dozen endemic plants in the Algenda Gorge alone, including a violet and a Sibthorpia, the two at the top, together with a cyclamen, the Balearic cyclamen, which is found again only on the Balearic Islands and just one locality on the southern coast, Mediterranean coast of France. And here you can find possibly one of the rarest of all, in fact so rare that it's until recently was extinct in the wild. This is unique to Menorca, a thing called Lysimachia minoricensis, the Menorcan loosestrife, and that used to be known from half a dozen of the brancos in Menorca, none of the other Balearic areas. It was, however, well, it was lost from Menorca, but because of the fact it has naturally variegated, very attractive leaves, it had been maintained in cultivation in one or two botanic gardens, including here in the UK at Cambridge. So there was a source of plants to restock it into the wild, and that is now an ongoing project under the auspices of the Biosphere Reserve to return the Menorcan loosestrife back to its original and one and only home. So everything I've shown you so far is basically spring. Autumn is another great period to visit, of course. Most of the flowers have turned to fruits, and those fruits attract all sorts of interesting birds, particularly fruit-eating birds such as blackcaps. These are, of course, our blackcaps, which are heading to the largely heading to the juniper forests of the Atlas Mountains for the winter. They do stop off, and sometimes stop off for the whole winter in Menorca, feeding upon the various local native berries. Later in the autumn, coming from November onwards, Menorca is absolutely inundated with really familiar northern migrants, huge numbers of song thrushes and robins, together with a good sprinkling of other winter migrants, including particularly down in the marshlands, just a few overwintering bluethroats, to name just a few. Autumn is also the time to go and see fungi, and they can be hugely spectacular, with the very, very, very totally, completely, wholly deadly destroying angel on the left, and this marvelous pepperpot pepperpot fungus, the one on the right hand side here, the one which is very recently rediscovered in Britain, but is not of regular occurrence anywhere in this country, and is very much a denizen of areas further to the south. The pepperpot earth star. The autumn also is the time to see the big insects at their best. So these can include things like very dramatic Egyptian locust with its wonderfully vertically striped eyes, praying mantis, mole crickets, by the autumn, they've grown, they've got biggest that they're going to get, and they're often more abundant than they're going to get at any other time. That's the time to go and see them. And that's not all. We've got the dragonflies as well, from the very spectacular scarlet darter through to the very common red-winged darter. And then the most wonderful wacky beetles you can possibly imagine. This rather wonderful weevil and this incredibly wonderful ground beetle, which just are, many of which are unique to the islands and are as attractive a feature of any of the things to go for in the autumn. Autumn's also a great time for moths, migrant moths of sorts, including hummingbird hawk moths, migrant and breeders there. The other one of the migrants which we see as the holy grail of the mothing world, crimson speckled moths. We see all too few of those in the UK, well, very common in the autumn in Menorca. And if you're lucky, you can also find that dramatic beastie. This is, again, not a native species. This is the Chinese oak silk moth, which was introduced into northwest Spain to Catalonia to actually set up a silk industry. It escaped, as they do, and has established 2 breeding areas in Catalonia and also in the Balearic Islands, in both Menorca and Mallorca. And it's a big one. That's a good hand-span across. And I can't, of course, overlook the spiders in the autumn. They are marvellous. We think of the wasp spider as a biggie. Well, that's common there, but of the same scale, that's the greater wasp spider. She's even more magnificent than our ordinary wasp spider. And like the our wasp spider, the male is tiny, insignificant, but at least he can scurry out of the way when he's seen as a likely source of food by his mate once he's done the deed. Some of the other vertebrates other than birds, not huge numbers once again in terms of number of species, but they're interesting. The Algerian hedgehog. So this is the hedgehog which occurs in the Balearics and North Africa and parts of southern Spain. Much paler and is the only species of hedgehog to be found on the island. The only species of animal hedgehog, well, as opposed to vegetable hedgehog. Then we come on to the reptiles, the 2 shelled ones being the Hermann's tortoise and the European pond tortoise. There is now, or terrapin, there is also now the introduced North American red-eared terrapin as well. Very abundant, particularly the Hermann's tortoise, although interestingly, it's believed that that was perhaps a very early introduction, perhaps even as early as Roman times, or even pre-Roman times, where they were introduced as sources of food into various places in the Mediterranean where they didn't occur naturally. The lizards on the island are almost all Italian wall lizards. This is a species which is probably the most dispersible of all of the wall lizards of Europe and has found its way all around the Mediterranean in boats, and on driftwood and so on and so forth. It gets its way around. It's even colonized the eastern seaboard of North America in places. In colonizing Menorca, as it did, over the course of the 20th century, it displaced the native lizards, and there is the endemic native Lilford's wall lizard, the black one at the bottom here, which has been displaced from almost all of Menorca, apart from the offshore islets. It still survives there. If you want to see it, you've then got to negotiate a trip out to the offshore islets, which is difficult but not impossible. And once there, they are abundant. And just a few of the other vertebrates, the geckos, 2 species of gecko on the island, and the frogs and toads, both tree frogs and Balearic toads. Used to be called the green toad, but has recently been re-identified or reclassified as the Balearic toad to distinguish it from the more widespread green toad. Both of these actually, it's believed, old ancient introductions onto Menorca. The Balearic toad, even though it's called the Balearic toad, is probably native of northern Italy, and from there it's been introduced onto Corsica and also onto the Balearic Islands. The other feature of autumn, though, is that known as second spring. The fact is that there's a whole suite of the bulbous species which comes into bloom particularly and only in the autumn, ranging from these wonderful autumn crocuses, the Merenderas, through to dwarf daffodils, squills, autumn squills, and various arums. These are all, many of them are endemics to the Balearics. They're all delightful, and they alone, again, are a good reason to turn up on the Balearics in October. Along with this, the sea squill, one of the most dramatic plants of all on the island. You can see it all around the year round, because it has huge bulbs which sit in very shallow soil, which would make them very vulnerable to being nibbled and browsed by sheep and goats if it were not for the fact that they contain deadly poisons within them. They're therefore safe. They produce leaves in the spring, the leaves die down, and then in the autumn out come these wonderful metre-high flowering spikes full of fragrant white flowers, attracting insects of all sorts. So, marvellous feature of the autumn months. That just leaves me to talk about the wetlands. We haven't talked about wetlands to any great extent yet, but notwithstanding the fact that we're in the Mediterranean, we're in a very dry area, we do have some fantastic wetlands on the islands, including coastal inlets, inland marshes, and brackish marshes, which are semi-tidal inlets in the island's interior. These all support birds, and I'm going to show you a selection of those now, all of which can easily be seen everywhere and anywhere you can find Autumnal's gull. Massive increase in recent years. The breeding of them in the Ebro Delta on the adjacent Spanish coast, that breeding population has increased hugely, and most of the birds which we see in Menorca derived ultimately, has been shown through colour ringing, from breeding in the Ebro Delta colony. To be found everywhere around the island, even in the ship infested harbours, where they very happily come to bread thrown for them. Long-legged wading type birds, the heron and other groups, well, we've got all of the Mediterranean specialities, from great white and cattle egrets, of course little egrets as well, through to greater flamingos. The egrets breed, the flamingos don't yet, but I think it's just a matter of time that sufficient numbers come over either from the Camargue or from the Cottigliana and settle down to breed in some of the areas of Menorca. And then we have the waders. We have the breeding waders, such as black-winged stilts in large numbers. They leave the islands during the winter months, so you won't see those if you go in midwinter, nor will you see little ring plovers or indeed Kentish plovers. They all breed in and around the coasts of the island. And then you get a whole suite of purely migratory waders, including, very familiar to us, things like spotted redshanks and greenshanks. So good, so Abberton Reservoir. Pretty much that could be a site of Abberton Reservoir with the 2 species of egret now, the coots, the mallards, so on and so forth. Not yet at Abberton, however, despite the, appalling photograph. Have you got the purple chickens wandering around, as in the purple swamp hens? Menorca, you can find in the wetlands in Menorca nowadays, purple swamp hens on almost every freshwater wetland on the island. When I started visiting there 35 years ago, there were none. Indeed, they were just being reintroduced onto the island of Majorca. Whether we've been colonized from Majorca or direct from a continent, we don't know, but we now know that they have colonized our island very effectively. Also, perhaps stemming from reintroduction schemes in Majorca, we also have ferruginous ducks, particularly in the autumn, and 1 or 2 crested coots, or red-knobbed coots as they're now known. Rather easily distinguished by the fact that they've got the red neck ring around their necks, which is of course a plastic ring, and that's a sign that that was one of the ones definitely from the reintroduction on into the Albufera marsh in Majorca. So there's a whole range of wetland birds on the island, and I just want to finish off with the last few, which are really quite special ones which may be birds to watch out for in the future, because they are being areas from birds from defined geographic areas. These are birds which are speciating or potentially speciating. The shag of the Mediterranean, for example, top left, is subspecies, currently considered subspecies Desmarestii. It's rather like our shag, but in the juvenile form or the immature form, very much whiter underneath. It's a little different in size as well, and some differences genetically. There's no evidence yet to suggest it's genetically so different it should be treated as a separate species, but of course, in due course, it's the sort of thing which certainly could become a species in its own right. As indeed has happened with the Mediterranean Gorges shearwater, now called Scopolis shearwater. The Gorges shearwater from the Mediterranean and the Northeast Atlantic Islands always used to be thought of as one, but being genetically isolated, now treated as being the ones that you can see from the coast of Menorca and do breed on the islets of Menorca. They are Scopolis. The other breeding species on Menorca is, well, there are actually 2. The main species probably breeding in Menorca and all of Majorca is the Balearic shearwater, one that we know quite well. It's a species which was separated from the Manx shearwater superspecies some decades ago, has long been recognised as different by virtue of its size, its call, its behaviour, its plumage. And but it does number only about 2,000 pairs, all breeding on the Balearics. Menorca has some of those, but recently it's been discovered that it's co-breeding with a population of the Mediterranean shearwater, which is another Manx split from the Manx shearwater. And they are breeding together on the island, with some suggestion there may also be introgression between them, i.e. they're hybridizing. So not only is the Balearic shearwater suffering from rat predation on its breeding islands, it's now also potentially suffering as a species from genetic introgression. Staying with the seabirds, you don't often see them, really quite difficult to see, but there are Mediterranean storm petrels breeding there. Once again, These are a bird which is genetically really well isolated from the storm petrels of the Northwest Atlantic, and it does have quite substantial genetic differences, and I have a fairly strong suspicion that may well be treated in not too far distant times as a separate subspecies, a separate species in its own right. The idea of speciation on islands is one of the real values of islands. This is why the Galapagos are so important. We know them because isolation leads to speciation. And that's happening in other groups of birds as well. Sadly, one cannot now go to Menorca and see the Balearic warbler. Indeed, you've never been able to go and see the Balearic warbler there because when this species was found on, this bird was found on Menorca 30 years ago and more, it wasn't known as the Balearic warbler. It's called the Marmara's warbler, which were also known from the Balearic Islands and from Corsica, Sardinia. The genetic separation now of the Marmara's warbler into the true Marmaras of Corsica and Sardinia and the Balearic warbler of Balearic Islands, that's now confirmed. They are different species genetically and diagnosably different in plumage, but sadly from Menorca the Balearic warbler has gone. Driven out, it seems, by the invasion of Menorca by Dartford warblers. Dartford warblers have come in, taken over the similar scrub habitats, and simply it's a feature of the fact of the small size of Menorca and the, as I've said already, the relative lack of complexity in the landscape, which means there's no ability for the two species to coexist in different niches. So no Balearic warblers to be found. You can, however, find Balearic woodchat shrikes, the rather different looking woodchat shrike with very much reduced, completely absent sometimes, white at the base of the primaries. This is a bird of the Balearic Islands, treated generally as a subspecies, but there is quite a strong push now to recognise the differences genetically are very substantial, and it is pretty recognisable in now in plumage terms as a species in its own right. An armchair tick in the waiting. And here's an armchair tick which has now arrived. Spotted flycatcher to all intents and purposes, but it has long been recognised that the Tyrrhenian Islands have a spotted flycatcher which looks different to some extent to our spotted flycatcher. It's not as spotted on its breast, and its forehead, for example, is more piebald with the pale grey ground colour showing through. So that is different, and it's been investigated genetically. The Mediterranean flycatcher is now a full species in its own right, and of course, being on the migration route of spotted flycatchers, you can see and compare both on Menorca. So, there you have it. Menorca, the jewel of the Mediterranean, at least for me. It's compact, it's diverse, easygoing landscape to get around, wildlife everywhere, little impact of tourism, largely a result of the UNESCO and the EU designations. For us as naturalists, it has archaeology, it has flowers, insects, birds, you name it, plus the food, plus the weather. What more could you want? I would say the reason I've been there on so many occasions in the past is I've been largely as a result of taking groups there, wildlife tourism groups for honeyguide wildlife holidays. It's a company I've worked for more than any others as a wildlife tour leader, and it's one that I am very happy to work for because we have a principle that every one of our customers on every one of our holidays pays a surcharge of now 50 euros or £40 on their holiday, which goes directly into conservation projects in the places we visit. And in doing that, we are absolutely unique as a wildlife tour company, I believe, putting money from every person back into local wildlife projects. The project we support there, or the organisation we support, is GOB, Group Balearic Ornithologica, which is the voluntary sector body for ecological, responsible ecology, green tourism on the island of Menorca, GOB Menorca. They are wonderful, fantastic organisation to support. They carry out everything that, for example, the RSPB does, education, reserves, engagement, stuff that the BTO do, research, ringing, stuff that all conservation bodies do, interacting with the planning system to ensure that the authorities do not allow development which is going to damage the environment. They administer the Marine Nature Reserve, and in the way that the Marine Conservation Society does. They administer agri-environment schemes in the way that government bodies in the UK, DEFRA, do. And they also, on top of all of that, run an animal rescue centre like the RSPCA. So it's a one-stop shop for everything that needs to be done about the environment in Menorca, and they have a pitifully small membership of only about 1,000. So the support we've been able to give them, amounting over 25 years to getting on for £10,000, has been very much valued by them, and we've developed a very good, strong working relationship with them. So on that basis, I would like to say thank you for listening to me. I hope I haven't gone along too long. I guess I'll hand you back now. It's time for questions. Thank you very much.